once said that astrology is a divinatory practice capable of predicting only the past. It would seem to be just a joke, but after all, needless to deny it, it is the opinion of a very large part of the scientific world. And this is where it gets weird. Because apparently centuries of discoveries in the field of astronomy have not yet managed to dent the fascination nor diminish the interest that people of all social statuses have in this ancient discipline. But why so much interest in predictions and character profiles, even at a time in history like ours, where knowledge seems to have deprived astrology of its fundamental basis? The answer may lie in the need to define our own personality and that of others, and in the way we perceive reality, shaping part of our expectations of it. It is a psychological need, then, a door we human beings need to leave wide open to the unknown. An escape route, one might say, and more a desire to put the responsibility for all our actions back into the hands of something greater than ourselves. And all this makes astrology resemble some naturalistic religion, something one would not even have the right to opine on. But then there is the more crudely scientific aspect to examine, and that is what we are here for today. We don't begrudge the many believers, or even curious and mere sympathizers. To begin with, allow me a very brief historical introduction to the origins of astrology. The Babylonians were the first to believe that there was a correspondence between the motion of the eternal sky and temporal earthly events. In ancient times, the universe was an absolute mystery, and any of its manifestations, such as comets or eclipses, were feared because they were interpreted as evidence of a higher will, signs of positive or negative happenings. Within a few centuries, astrology spread throughout the Mediterranean. And in the 3rd century BC, the Greeks began to predict not only the course of events, but also the fate of each individual based on the positions of the planets. Although much time has passed since then, even today for astrology, the conformation of the sky, position of stars and planets, at the time of birth can influence the life of the individual. These days, however, we know the distances that separate the Earth from stars and planets, and we're also able to measure the amount of radiation that reaches us from them. And based on this data, it is easy to prove that the stars cannot have any effect on human beings. The distances, in fact, are so great, on the order of many tens of trillions of kilometers for even the nearest stars, that the physical effects of phenomena such as gravitation and radiation are, compared to the Earth, completely negligible. The only celestial bodies that really affect our planet are the Sun and the Moon, which are much less distant from us than the pseudo-constellations of the zodiac. In short, astrology might have had a justification centuries ago, when people knew absolutely nothing about the sky, and they ignored what they were and how far away they were. It was then safe to assume that all stars, without distinction, could have some influence on the Earth, as in the case with the Sun and the Moon. Stars, planets, as is evident, it is only in the course of the last 2 centuries that the kind of knowledge has been acquired to render the claims of astrology totally nonsensical. This does not imply that before that time astronomy and astrology were one and the same, and that no distinction existed between them. Only in ancient times were the words astronomy and astrology interchangeable. Born out of the common practice of observing the sky, they were later separated. Astronomers continued to look up to understand the mechanisms and reasons for the motions of the stars, or why the planets moved in complex ways on the celestial vault. Astrologers, on the other hand, persisted in chasing the signs of the future and tracing in what they saw the myriad clues of celestial influences. Okay, let's take it for granted. Astrology implicitly assumes the existence of some astral influences due to the Sun, Moon, and other celestial objects, such as, for example, the major planets. If astral influences do exist, however, it would first be necessary to find the consistent laws that provide their nature and extent. wouldn't they? Well, currently, only 4 types of fundamental forces are known: strong interaction, weak interaction, electromagnetism, and gravitation. Into what kind of fundamental force can we place these astral influences? Is this a new fundamental force? Then it should be defined. From another point of view, if these influences are not forces, then are they energies? If yes, the same problem as before arises. Energy is perfectly quantifiable. Indeed, many forms of energy are known: kinetic, potential, elastic, radioactive, chemical, nuclear, internal, etc. What form of energy could correspond to the alleged astral influences invoked by astrologers? Science, of course, does not deny astrology the existence of interactions between various bodies in the universe. Gravitation, corpuscular, and electromagnetic radiation from stars do exist, whether detectable or not. But these bodies are so distant that they exert little influence on human beings. The smartphone you are holding in your hand at the moment exerts a greater influence on you than the positions of the sun, the moon, and the various planets. And the doctor attending childbirth exerts a gravitational attraction on the newborn child that is greater than that exerted by the planet Mars on the same newborn child, and a tidal force trillions of times more intense. And if astrologers continue to insist on the influence of the planets, why then not consider the possible action of the enormous mass of the Sun or that of the Moon, which is very close to the Earth? As far as we know, every force weakens with distance. An object farther away has less force on you than something closer. Yet astrologers claim that all planets have equal, or at least comparable, effects. So nearby Venus and distant Pluto can affect your life in some way and in the same way. This means that according to the astrologers' own statements, distance should not be a factor in this force. Of course, neither should mass, otherwise Jupiter would dominate the planets and poor tiny Mercury would be excluded. So one would want to ask them, what on earth is it all about then? Through what form of energy can the position of a certain planet at our birth affect the rest of our lives? A clear answer to this question has never been given. The so-called astral influences, which are neither forces nor energies, have in fact never been confirmed by any scientific experience worthy of the name. In the face of this contention, astrologers defend themselves with some very little reason by claiming that the fact that a physical mechanism is not found does not mean that the mechanism does not exist. Even in science, in fact, there has been no shortage of entirely similar situations. When Kepler, for example, found his 3 laws on the motion of celestial bodies, he had no idea why celestial bodies move precisely that way. Specifically, he ignored the existence of a gravitational force that would act as a counterweight to the centrifugal force and prevent planets from escaping into infinite space. And Newton, too, enunciated his theory of universal gravitation in open contrast to the conception contemporary with him, for which the existence of forces capable of acting at a distance and, moreover, in a vacuum was not admissible, forces about whose nature Newton himself was unable to pronounce. Unfortunately for astrologers, however, there is a big difference in their situation. The laws found by Kepler and Newton were able to predict exactly any kind of astronomical phenomena, an ability in the face of which the momentary inability to understand the nature of the mechanism could even pass into the background. Whereas in astrology, not only does the mechanism remain unknown, the phenomenon that would like to explain also turns out to be non-existent. In short, to put it very simply, give me an astrological method that consistently produces results that can be verified by everyone, and the fact that we cannot understand how it works will matter absolutely nothing to anyone. Until someone has proven that astrology works, questioning how it works seems really pointless to us. Doesn't it seem it to you too? There is only one way to cut the bullseye off to test experimentally whether astrologers are really able to do what they claim to be able to do. Before moving on, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our daily videos. Unfortunately for astrologers, statistical studies conducted objectively and honestly have consistently shown that astrology proceeds by nothing more than pure and simple combinations of chance, and that signs or planets have no particular influence on the fate of any individual. In particular, a statistical study was seriously carried out in California with the preliminary consensus of some 40 astrologers. This study, but there are hundreds of others which used a series of blind cross tests, clearly and objectively demonstrated that the predictions of astrologers have no real correspondence other than by pure chance, at best, or that they are totally erroneous. The claimed and/or predicted correlation between the position of the planets and other celestial bodies at the time of birth and an individual's personality does not exist at all. And in the face of such contentions, what do astrologers do? They do not respond. They stammer far-fetched explanations or continually shift the terms of the problem, even to the point of childishly reporting that there are more things in heaven and earth than science can imagine, and that skeptics are just arid scientists who believe only what they can explain. Everything we think to avoid admitting that their system of association between heaven and earth is based on trivial, symbolic assonances that have their origin in the mists of time. Needless to go round and round, even today, so many centuries later, to define the kind of influence a constellation can have on an individual birth, astrologers, in fact, use only the characteristics suggested by their names, and therefore by their forms. Leo, strength; Aries, stubbornness; Libra, balance, etc. Nothing but that. And of this, of their naivete, astrologers are somewhat ashamed. What about the planets? Well, to think that when planets are in a given constellation they can have a certain effect rather than another makes no sense, since the constellation themselves are something completely artificial. Again, astrologers do not care about distances and masses, but simply rely on visual and emotional impressions. Is Mars red in color? Then having it in one's birth chart will be a sign of strength and virility. Is Venus bright and white? It means a sense of beauty and harmony. In short, for planets, astrologers match the characteristics of the gods they represent, described so well already by the ancient Greeks. In those days, celestial objects seemed to be gods, important spirits, or at the very least, symbols of representatives of divine characters who spent their time getting in the way of people's daily lives. People eagerly looked for celestial signs of what the gods would do next. In this context, a system that linked bright planets and important constellations to significant life issues was attractive and reassuring. And even today, despite many efforts at scientific education, astrologers have not changed their thinking one iota, merely slavishly copying the character traits of the Olympian gods. For them, thinking of Venus as a desert world covered in clouds and as hot as an oven is far less attractive than seeing it as helping to decide whom to marry. Then there is another aspect to consider, that of location. Indeed, astrology is curiously a child of the temperate regions of the Northern Hemisphere, and indeed has been adopted only in these regions, certainly because of the phenomena of the seasons. In the temperate regions of the Southern Hemisphere, the seasons are reversed, which removes any verisimilitude with the associated symbolism. Therefore, the sign of Leo, which corresponds to the boreal summer, is symbolically connected to the strength of the sun, which evidently does not work in the other hemisphere, at that time in the middle of the austral winter. In the tropical zone, the situation is even worse from an astrological point of view. There are only two seasons, the dry season and the wet season, subject to regional variations, and without noticeable variations in temperature. In the polar regions, most of the astrological systems in place do not allow the preparation of lasting horoscopes. Certain stars and signs are in fact never visible, while astrological houses, which are absolutely essential for the organization of horoscopes, cannot similarly be calculated and no longer cover in any way the ecliptic in most cases. What, in this regard, is the physical meaning of astrological houses, and why can these not exist in certain cases above and beyond the polar circles? In fact, these astrological houses, wherever they are found in the universe, do not strictly correspond to anything. From another point of view, if astrology were a science, one could legitimately wonder what the horoscope of an individual born in a place other than Earth would be, since the laws of physics remain constant everywhere in the universe. And again, what sign could the first child born on Mars possibly be? Curiously, a kind of spin-off of astrology has been emerging in recent years, probably aimed at circumventing the problem of the impossibility of giving an answer to the mechanism that produces the distant influence of stars and planets. This is a new forecasting practice, which claims to tie the fate of an unborn child not to the sign, but to the month of birth, understood, however, as referring to the climatic season and not the astronomical one. It seems that to reach this conclusion, data on 1,749,400 patients were cross-referenced, showing that as many as 55 different types of diseases have a direct link to the month of birth. Apparently, the healthiest are definitely born in May, while those born in October may consider themselves more unlucky in terms of health. The risk of asthma and respiratory problems is higher for those born in July, September, and October. Children born in November, on the other hand, are at higher risk of developing the notorious attention deficit disorder, as well as hyperactivity, while those born during the winter go on to have more neurological problems. Will this be true? It is not totally to be ruled out, and it perhaps deserves some kind of investigation. But this turn towards the scientific method will certainly not be the one to save astrology's bad reputation. Other news is that of the now rampant fad for scientific astrology, which is unfortunately doing far more damage than the petty, simplistic astrology to which we have been accustomed for decades. In fact, astrologers boast that they work out horoscopes by scientific methods, using computers to know and calculate the position of the stars. Needless to say, even assuming the correctness of the methods for determining the position of the planets at a given time, the result still does not change. What is obtained has nothing scientific about it, computer or no computer. To put it more brutally, if we fed garbage into a computer, it can only return garbage. And I hope that you will agree with me as well. By insisting on the non-scientific nature of astrology, I don't want to argue that it is an art completely lacking any kind of legitimacy. If it remains within the scope of cultural history and religions without delving into bogus, pseudo-scientific predictions, there can be no well-founded reason to oppose it. On the contrary, ancient astrological beliefs are often necessary for understanding symbols and allegories in the history of art and literature. So what's the harm? Sure, astrology doesn't work, but it's all fun, right? No, wrong. And for at least 3 good reasons. The first of which is that astrology promotes the worst thing in the world, uncritical thinking. If you buy into everything they tell you, and this is true in every area, and you can't think for yourself, you can never function as a human being. The second is that astrology takes away meaning from the true greatness of the universe. We live in a fantastic world, dominated by beauty and full of things to be discovered. A world where we can build the future by our own good deeds. A future that no magical practice can ever reveal to us as predetermined. The third reason is economic and social. In the world, there are currently hundreds of thousands of practitioners in the astrological field, all people who speculate and enrich themselves on the weaknesses of those who do not possess enough antibodies to defend themselves against their paid fairy tales. And all of this not only pollutes our pockets and minds, but increases the moral disorder of the information system. In this regard, do you know how many entries Google returns if you type in the word astronomy? Try it yourself. It's 650 million. And now also try the word astrology. The result? Well, as many as 387 million. 2 absolutely comparable values. It's frightening, isn't it?